I have told this story only once before, to my own son on the eve of his wedding, and even then I could not get through it without my voice failing me somewhere near the end. My brother would call that a weakness of character. He would be wrong, as he so often was about such things, until she showed him he was wrong, quietly and entirely, without ever raising her voice. His name is Edmund Vane, the Duke of Ashcroft. They called him the War Duke in the years before he came home, not as a nickname, but as a verdict. He had commanded a regiment through 2 campaigns in a manner that frightened his own generals, not because he was reckless, but because he was so perfectly, coldly controlled. I was his younger brother, his aide, his shadow across 3 years of service, and I can tell you that Edmund did not feel things the way other men did. He felt them deeper. He simply refused to let them show. He thought that was strength. I knew even then that it was armor. We came home to Ashcroft Manor in the autumn, and Edmund settled back into the estate the way a stone settles into a riverbed, hard, silent, immovable. The county held its breath around him. Mothers steered their daughters to the far side of any room he entered. He had a title, a fortune, and a face that had been called everything from commanding to terrifying, and he was 37 years old and entirely alone, and none of it appeared to trouble him in the least. It troubled me. It troubled our mother, though she was too wise to say so aloud in his presence. And it troubled, I suspect, the ghost of Captain Martin Halley, though the dead cannot be troubled, only remembered, and Edmund remembered Martin Halley with a faithfulness that put the living to shame. Martin had been Edmund's closest officer. They had shared a tent, a table, and a silence that spoke more than most men's words across 3 years of service. He was the kind of man who made a room feel more principled by being in it, not through speeches, but through an easiness of character that was, in my observation, entirely genuine. I had known perhaps 4 men like that in my life. Martin had been the best of them. In the final month of the second campaign, Martin took a musket ball that was aimed. There is no other honest way to say it, at Edmund's back. He lived for 4 days afterward. On the second of those days, Edmund sat beside him for 12 hours without moving. I know because I sat outside the tent and did not leave either. What Martin said in those 12 hours, I do not know entirely. What I know is what Edmund told me afterward in pieces over a period of years, the way a man releases a river 1 brick at a time. Martin had a daughter. He had been widowed 5 years earlier, and his daughter, her name was Cecily, she would have been 19 that autumn, had been left in the care of his elder brother, a man of poor character and considerable debt. Martin's only fear in those 4 days was Cecily. Not death, not the wound, Cecily. He asked Edmund to see to her. Edmund said yes without hesitation. I believe he would have said yes to anything Martin asked in those last hours. I also believe he meant it, every syllable, with the whole of himself. That was the thing about Edmund. When he gave his word, it was not a courtesy. It was a structural element. You could build a house on it. We buried Martin on a hillside in the gray light of an October morning, and Edmund stood over the grave for a long time after the others had gone, and I stood at a respectful distance and said nothing, because there was nothing useful to say. When he finally turned and walked back toward camp, his face was arranged in its usual composure, and I knew it had cost him more than he would ever account for. He kept the promise. He inquired over the following year through careful channels about Cecily Halley's situation. The news that came back was never reassuring, but for some months there was nothing legally actionable. He sent money anonymously through a solicitor he trusted. He did not tell me this until much later. I asked him once why he had not said anything, and he said, because it would have made it about me. That was Edmund. He had a code that operated entirely independently of praise. The debt came to light a full year after our return. Martin's brother, one Mr. Horace Halley, a man I shall describe only as possessing neither honor nor the appearance of it, had accumulated obligations against Martin's modest estate that had, through a variety of legal maneuvers I will not dignify with detail, attached themselves to Cecily as his dependent. The sum was not enormous by Edmund's measure. It was, by Cecily's, a life. Edmund found out on a Thursday. By Friday morning he had spoken with his solicitor, settled the sum in full, and written a letter to Mr. Halley informing him that the debt was discharged and that he had thereby relinquished all claim over Martin's daughter. Saturday morning, I found Edmund standing at the window of his study looking out at the long drive with an expression I had not seen on him before. Not confusion exactly, more like a man who has moved a chess piece and is only now considering what comes next. "I have discharged the debt," he said without turning. I heard, I said. Dawson told me at breakfast. She needs a home. She has a home, presumably, some arrangement. With Horace Halley. He said the name the way one identifies a bad smell. That is not a home, that is a cage with the latch broken. I waited. Martin asked me to see to her, Edmund said. I have discharged the legal obligation, but that is not the same thing as seeing to her. No, I agreed, it isn't. He turned from the window then, and I saw that he had been thinking about this for some time, longer perhaps than the 24 hours since he learned of the debt. Perhaps since the tent. I am going to call on her, he said. I am going to offer her a settlement, a house, and income independence. He paused. If she will not take that, I will offer her my name. I stared at him. You will offer her marriage. I will offer her the protection of it. She need not. He stopped, rearranged something behind his eyes. She need not take it as anything more than a practical arrangement. She has options. I will make that clear. Edmund, I said carefully, you are the Duke of Ashcroft. You cannot simply walk up to a girl of 19 you have never met and offer her a practical arrangement as though you are negotiating a trade agreement. Why not? It is precisely what it is. Because she is a person, because she has feelings about the thing. Because, I stopped, because he was looking at me in that way he had, utterly steady, and I could see that he had already decided, and my objections were for the record only. I will be respectful, he said. I will be clear. I will give her every option to decline. Will you? I said, and something in my voice made him look at me a moment longer than usual. Yes, he said with the faintest edge, I will. I went with him, of course. I was not going to let my brother do this alone. The Halley house was in a village some 12 miles from the manor, a respectable size, but with the look of a place that has been neglected in small, steady ways for several years. The garden was overgrown at the front, though I noticed as we came round the side of the drive that someone had been working the kitchen garden with considerable attention. The beds there were neat and well turned, strikingly at odds with the rest of the property. The front steps needed pointing. The butler who let us in had the eyes of a man enduring rather than serving. Cecily Halley was in the small sitting room at the back of the house. I will tell you what I saw when she stood. She was slight and very still, the way people are still when stillness is something they have learned rather than born into. She had her father's coloring. Martin had been dark-haired, fine-featured, with eyes that saw things quickly and did not miss, and those same eyes were on us now, taking in Edmund and taking in me and not flinching, though I could see the effort it cost her. She was dressed plainly. Her hands were clasped in front of her with a precision that suggested she had placed them there deliberately to keep them from betraying her. She was not what the county would have called beautiful. She was, I thought immediately, something better than that. She was entirely, unnervingly present. Your Grace, she said to Edmund, Mr. Vane. She looked at me when she said it, and I thought, she has been told who is coming. She has been thinking about this. Edmund did not sit immediately. He stood, and I watched him look at her the way he had sometimes looked at terrain, not calculating exactly, but reading, filing. Miss Halley, he said, thank you for receiving us. You discharged my uncle's debt, she said. There was no performance in her voice, no excess of gratitude, no false ease. Without condition, apparently, that is unusual. It was Martin's debt, not yours, Edmund said. It should never have reached you. Something moved in her face, gone before I could name it. And yet it did, she said. And you have removed it. I am grateful, Your Grace. I am also aware that there is something you wish to say, and I would prefer you say it directly. I saw Edmund's chin lift very slightly. It was the way he looked when something surprised him pleasantly. He said, I intend to. I have spoken with my solicitor. There is a cottage property on the Ashcroft estate, separate, modest, entirely yours to manage as you choose, that I would like to settle on you with an income sufficient to maintain it. You would be independent. You would owe me nothing. That is the first option I am prepared to offer. Cecily looked at him for a long moment, and the second. My name, he said. A marriage of convenience, formal and proper, which would give you the full protection of the Ashcroft title and income. It would not require of you anything beyond what you are willing to give, and you would have every right to live as you choose within it. He paused. I made a promise to your father. I intend to keep it. But the shape of that keeping is yours to determine. The room was very quiet. Outside, a cart passed in the lane, and the sound of it faded, and then there was nothing but the small fire and the three of us. "You knew my father," she said at last. "He was the finest man I served beside," Edmund said. "He saved my life. I do not say that as a rhetorical device. I mean it precisely." Cecily looked down at her clasped hands for a moment. When she looked up, her eyes were bright with something she was not going to let fall. "He spoke of you," she said. "In his letters, he said you were a man of absolute word and that this was rarer than rubies." She paused. "He did not say whether you were kind." Edmund was still for a moment. Then, in a voice I had not heard him use before, lower, stripped of the commander's clarity, he said, "I am not always kind. I am trying to be." I do not think he had planned to say that. Cecily looked at him for a long time. Then she said, "I will take the cottage." Edmund nodded. "Very well." "For now," she said. He looked at her. "I should like to know you a little," she said, with a steadiness that I found extraordinary in a girl of 19 who had been living under a difficult roof in an impossible situation. "Before I decide anything else, I think that is reasonable. My father trusted you. I am prepared to try, but I am not prepared to be settled like a debt paid and filed away." There was a silence in which I did not breathe. "No," Edmund said quietly. "That is not what I intend." "Good," she said. "Then I will take the cottage, and I should be glad if you would call on me there." She said it simply, as though she were making a sensible arrangement for tea, but there was something underneath it that was not simple at all, something that said, "I see you. I am not afraid of you. I will decide for myself what this is." Edmund said, "I will call on Wednesday." We rode home in silence for a long time. Then I said, "She is remarkable." Edmund said nothing for another mile. Then, "Yes." And after another half-mile, "She has been working that kitchen garden herself. I could see the tool marks in the beds. She has been doing it all winter." I looked at him. He was looking at the road ahead with the expression of a man who has filed something away in a place he intends to return to. She moved into the cottage at the end of October. It was a stone building at the edge of the park, all of 3 rooms and a garden that had been let go somewhat, and she set about the garden within 4 days of her arrival. Edmund watched this from a distance, literally, the first time. I caught him standing at the window of the library that overlooked the lane to the cottage with a cup of tea growing cold in his hand. "The tea," I said. He looked at the cup as if surprised to find it there, and set it down. He called on Wednesday, as he had said. He called on Saturday. He called the following Wednesday again, and the Wednesday after that, and the pattern established itself with the inevitability of tide. I asked him once what they talked about, and he said, "Everything," and would not elaborate. I extracted a better account from Dawson, who had it from the housekeeper, who had it from the cottage's daily girl. They argued about the management of the estate drainage, Cecily citing sources she had apparently read during 3 years of enforced quiet at her uncle's house. They discussed the campaigns in considerable detail. She had been given only a soldier's version of events and wanted the real one, the strategist's account, the terrain and the decisions and the cost, and Edmund gave it to her without softening, and this appeared to be precisely what she had wanted, because she had not asked for comfort. She had asked for the truth about her father's world. He played chess with her. He played it badly because she was better at it than he was, which Edmund had apparently not expected, and which appeared to delight rather than frustrate him. She beat him 3 times in a row before he began to take it seriously, and then it was a genuine contest, and she won anyway. She made him tea once and told him plainly that it was not good tea. He had been served tea by everyone from generals to earls, and not one of them had told him it was not good tea, because not one of them had wanted to. Cecily told him because it was true, and she saw no reason to pretend otherwise. She taught him the difference, the correct temperature, the correct time, a particular blend her father had kept, and Edmund listened with the focused attention he had once given to the angle of a hillside before a cavalry charge. He was a different person in that cottage. I do not mean a lesser person or a weakened one. I mean a person who had found a room in himself he had not known existed and was cautiously, carefully, with the discipline of a man who does nothing carelessly, learning what it contained. I will say this about Edmund. He was not a man who drifted. When he turned his attention to a thing, he turned all of it. And I watched over those weeks as the full weight of his attention, which was considerable, which had toppled better fortified positions than a stone cottage at the edge of a park, turned steadily, inexorably toward Cecily Halley. I am not certain he knew it himself, Not yet. It was Lady Fenwick who made him know it. In December, at a dinner at Lord Fenwick's house, the county's primary stage for social performance of every kind, Lady Fenwick remarked in Cecily's hearing, at a volume precisely calculated to be overheard, that it was remarkable what some women would do to secure a settlement, and that the Duke of Ashcroft's charity toward a plain little nobody was admirable if perhaps unwise. There was something in her delivery, a particular timing, a certain smile directed toward two of the other ladies, that suggested this was not the first time she had made this observation, merely the first time she had made it within range of its subject. I heard this, Cecily heard this. Edmund, across the room with a glass of port, and Lord Fenwick's second son did not. What I saw was Cecily turn toward Lady Fenwick with an expression of complete composure, and say, in a voice that carried no further than necessary, "I have heard that observation from a number of people, Lady Fenwick. What I find remarkable is that so many of them appear to have a great deal of information about arrangements they were not party to. The Duke of Ashcroft is a man of precise word. I trust him entirely. I cannot say the same for all the sources of your information." She said it pleasantly. She was smiling when she said it. Lady Fenwick opened her mouth and closed it again. The two ladies beside her suddenly found their wine glasses required close examination. The silence spread out in a circle from Cecily like rings on water, and she stood at the center of it with perfect calm, as though she had simply noted a fact about the weather. I set down my own glass and went to find Edmund. "Something just happened," I said. He looked at me. "Cecily," I said. Lady Fenwick said something uncharitable loudly in Cecily's hearing. Cecily answered it. "Is she well?" "She is perfectly well. She handled it with more composure than I would have, but you should know." I watched Edmund's face. Something moved through it quickly, then slowly like weather. He set his glass down with a deliberateness that was the opposite of carelessness. He crossed the room. I followed because I was not going to miss this. He found Cecily near the fireplace, now in conversation with Mrs. Alderton about the management of kitchen gardens in heavy frost, quite serene. Lady Fenwick had migrated to the far side of the room. Edmund stood beside Cecily, not obtrusively, not with the energy of a man making a statement to the room. Simply beside her in the way that is harder than any performance, the way that means, "I belong here." He said something low and quiet, which I later learned was, "I heard what happened. I am sorry I was not closer." Cecily looked up at him. "You don't need to be sorry, I managed." "I know you did," he said. "That isn't the same thing as wishing I had been there." A pause, then very quietly she said, "You came across the room." "Yes." "You didn't have to." "No," he said. "I wanted to." That, I think, was the moment. Not a declaration, not an altar or a proposal, just that. He wanted to, and he said so, and she heard it for what it was. The dinner proceeded. They stood together for the rest of the evening, not conspicuously, not as a performance for the room, but as two people who have, without announcement, made a quiet decision about where they belong. Edmund was not the same after that evening, not visibly different to anyone who did not know him. But I knew him and I could see it. The armor had developed a seam. He was not weakened. He was beginning, cautiously, to question whether the armor was still the point. He came to my rooms one January night at an unreasonable hour, which was unlike him, and sat down in the chair by the window without preamble, and said, "I am going to ask her to change the arrangement." I waited. "The cottage arrangement," he said. "I am going to ask her to marry me properly, not as a contract, not as protection." He looked at me with an expression I had never seen on my brother's face, not uncertainty exactly, but the quality of a man standing on entirely new ground, aware that the terrain is different and not yet certain of its laws. "I do not know what she will say." "I think," I said carefully, "that you have a better idea than you're claiming." She does not make it obvious." Something in his voice shifted. "She is the most honest person I have ever met, and I cannot read her the way I can read everyone else. It is," a pause, "it is rather alarming." "Edmund," I said, "you have been to that cottage 3 times a week for 3 months. You stood beside her at Fenwick's dinner without being asked, and she noticed every detail of the gesture and told you so. Ask her." He looked at me, then he looked at the window. Then he said, "She deserves to hear it said plainly, the real thing. I should have said more of the real thing from the beginning." "Yes," I said, "she does, and yes, you should have." "Go say it now." He went to the cottage on a February morning when the garden was just beginning to show the earliest fringe of green snowdrops first, because she had planted them in November, because apparently she had asked Mrs. Calloway from the estate garden for advice, and had spent an afternoon in the cold light pressing bulbs into the border with a focus that Edmund had observed from the library window and not mentioned. I did not go with him. That was for him alone. I was in the library when he came back 2 hours later. I looked up. He was standing in the doorway with the expression of a man who has discovered that the armor he has worn for years is still on his person, but no longer its most important feature. "Well," I said. "She said yes," he said. He crossed the room and sat down beside me, and for a moment neither of us said anything. Then I said, "How did you ask her?" He was quiet for a moment. Then, I told her I had not said it plainly enough in the beginning, that I had offered her options because I thought that was correct, and it was the right thing, she should always have had the choice, but I had not told her the real thing underneath the options. Which was that the promise to Martin was the beginning, but it had not been the whole of it for a very long time. That I came to the cottage on Wednesdays and Saturdays, because those were the days I was able to call on her without being obvious about every other day in between. He paused. That she was the only person I had met in 37 years who told me the tea was not good and taught me the difference, who argued about estate drainage at Lord Fenwick's dinner with citations, who answered Lady Fenwick without flinching, he stopped. "Who what?" I said. "Who made me feel that the room I had found in myself was not a liability," he said quietly, "but something worth having." I said nothing. He looked at the window. She laughed when I told her about the Wednesdays and Saturdays. She said she had known about the other days. The cottage's daily girl had mentioned that the library window overlooked the lane, and she had been quite aware of it, and she had said nothing because she was not going to make it easy for me to be comfortable with not saying the real thing. He was silent for a moment, and then something happened to his face that I had not seen happen to it since we were boys, a warmth that was neither controlled nor managed, simply present. She said she had been waiting for the real thing. "And then," I said. She cried a little when I said the part about Martin. I had not expected that. He stopped, pressed his thumb against the arm of the chair once precisely in the way he had when he was containing something. "I was glad I was there for it. They were married in March, in the village church at the foot of the estate. There was no grand London ceremony, no parade of county witnesses arranged for the effect of it. There was Edmund and Cecily and a small gathering of people they had individually chosen to be present, our mother, who wept unself-consciously and pressed Cecily's hand for a long time before the ceremony, which Cecily received with a grace that made our mother weep harder. There was Dawson, standing at the back with his hands folded and an expression of profound satisfaction. There were a handful of the estate people who had watched Edmund for years, and I think been quietly hoping for exactly this. I stood beside my brother, and I watched his face when she came down the aisle. She was in plain white, no grand gown, nothing that pretended to be other than what it was. No jewels beyond a pearl at her throat, which had been their mother's, and which Edmund had given her the week before without comment, and with a steadiness of hand I knew had cost him something. She walked without hurry, with her chin up and her eyes on Edmund, and if she was aware of the watching faces at all, she did not show it, because the watching faces were not what she was here for. Edmund looked at her the way a man looks at the one fact in the world that will not shift. I know that expression now because I have learned to read it in him. It is the only look he has ever had that is entirely without armor, entirely without management, entirely his. She looked at him the same way. The vicar married them. Edmund said his vows in the voice he reserved for things he meant absolutely, clear, unhurried, without the faintest inflection of performance. Cecily said hers in the voice of a woman who has considered the words and chosen them freely. When the ring went on her finger, she looked down at it once, and then up at him, and something passed between them that I cannot describe adequately and will not try. I will say only that I saw Edmund Vane, the most feared duke in 3 counties, the man who had stared down artillery fire without blinking, release a breath he had been holding for what looked like 37 years. There were people in the county who remarked in the months that followed about the oddness of the match, the war duke and a debtor's orphan, no grand connection, no great beauty by the county's measure, no obvious advantage to the arrangement. I heard 3 or 4 versions of this observation, and each time I thought, you see the debt that was discharged, you do not see what was given. Martin Halley gave his daughter into the world knowing what she was, clear-eyed and brave and entirely disinclined to pretend. He gave his trust to Edmund knowing what Edmund was, a man of absolute word who had not yet found what his word was for. He asked the one to look after the other with a faith that could only have come from knowing both of them deeply, and from a love that wanted for them something better than safety. Edmund did not put it this way aloud. He was not a man for speeches about invisible things, even when the invisible things were the whole substance of a life. But I know him. I have known him since he was 17 and too serious for his age, and already building the armor, piece by careful piece, that it took one plain-spoken, clear-eyed, chess-playing, bad-tea-criticizing girl to find the seam in and quietly, patiently, without fanfare or cruelty, take entirely apart. I saw them one afternoon in the summer that followed in the garden of the cottage. She had kept it, because she liked it, and Edmund had asked her to keep whatever she wished and meant it. They used it often in the evenings, that particular chair she was partial to, the small iron table they had carried out together and set under the apple tree. Edmund was sitting across from her, and she was reading to him from something. I could not hear the words from where I stood in the lane, and he was watching her face while she read. He was not watching the book, or the garden, or the long light of the summer afternoon on the apple branches. He was watching her face. I turned back before he saw me, because that look was not for me to witness. It was private in the way that very few things are private, not secret, but sacred. The way a man's whole self being visible in his face is always sacred, and rare, and worth protecting. He had been the most feared man in 3 counties. He had commanded regiments and managed an estate of considerable size with perfect cold control, and he had worn his word like a fortress and his composure like a coat of mail, and not one person in 37 years of living had told him that the tea was not good. And he was sitting in that garden watching his wife read aloud in the summer light, and he was undone by it in the best possible way, the way that doesn't unmake a man but instead shows him what he was made for, what all that precision and faithfulness and iron word had been practiced for without his knowing it. Martin Halley had asked him to see to her. He had done something far better than that. He had seen her truly wholly at the full weight of his considerable attention, and she had seen him in return, and it had been enough. It had been, as far as I could tell from the doorway of that summer garden, everything.